Okay, so David advising Solomon on his deathbed, and of course we see how Solomon takes every word to heart, and he fulfills his responsibilities and does what David asks as he consolidates his power. From David and Bathsheba, Solomon obviously gained a healthy religious upbringing in morality, which he shared with his hearers and ultimately with us, with his readers, right, in the wisdom literature. And it's interesting because you look at the three different writings in the scriptures that are typically ascribed to Solomon, and you look at Song of Solomon, right, or Song of Songs, and then you look at the Book of Proverbs, and you look at the Book of Ecclesiastes. It's interesting to see the different parts of his life that those may be encompassing, right? So if you look at the Song of Songs is typically viewed as Solomon being very young, right, when he's in love and he's experiencing love for the first time and he's really enjoying life as a young man. And then when he wrote the Book of Proverbs, he's lived longer, right? Maybe perhaps around middle age, where he's gained some experience and he has some very strong wisdom to impart to make sure that people don't fall into some of the pitfalls perhaps that he may have fallen into, and also to try to explain some of the things from his perspective, having gone through them, and how he might perhaps do things differently. And then, of course, you have the Book of Ecclesiastes, where it's obviously towards the end of his life, much later in life, where he's experienced a lot of the disappointments of life, and really has a much different perspective, in some ways a much darker perspective, but ultimately a perspective that still glorifies Yahweh and gives him the honor and glory that's due him. And the Book of Ecclesiastes is something we can touch upon another day. But just interesting to see the different stages of Solomon's life, and Proverbs falling probably around the middle of his life, where he would have been trying to impart much of that wisdom. We also want to note the influence of, even indirectly, of his grandparents and great-grandparents. And this is kind of interesting. Just kind of follow with me here. We're not going to spend a lot of time with this, but I thought I'd mention it. Remember that Solomon was a direct descendant of Ruth and Boaz, who fathered Obed, right? Ruth was known as a worthy and wise woman. Let's never forget that. So he was a descendant, a direct descendant of Ruth. Ruth 3:11 talks about Ruth being a worthy woman, right? Ruth 4:17-22 and Matthew 1:5-6. Ruth 4:17-22 and Matthew 1:5-6 show the lineage from Boaz and Ruth to Obed, and then to Jesse, and finally to David, Jesse being the father of David. We don't know a whole lot about Obed, but this is very interesting. We do know something of Jesse. And let's just look at a couple of the verses here. We don't know a lot about Jesse, but we know 2 Samuel 17:24-25 talks about Jesse, right? We won't read the whole thing, but let's turn there. 2 Samuel 17, because there's something interesting I want you to see there. Again, we're looking for context here, right? Why am I going through all this? Because we're looking for context about who Solomon was and where some of this wisdom came from. And we know, of course, that David himself was wise, that Sheba was wise. 2 Samuel 17, verse 24, at least later in life, right? They made some serious mistakes early on, but they did have some wisdom later in life, as we see described in the biblical record. 2 Samuel 17, of course, is when David was anointed to be king. Verse 24, let's backtrack this a little bit. 1 Samuel 16. You can hold your place in 2 Samuel 17, but let's go to 1 Samuel 16. That's where he was actually anointed. 1 Samuel 16, beginning with verse 1. Yahweh said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn." He's talking to, Yahweh's talking to Samuel. "Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." And then he goes and he meets with Jesse, and Jesse calls each of his sons in turn. So we see just Jesse in action, right? And that he is the father of David. And then if you go to 2 Samuel 17, 2 Samuel 17, beginning with verse 24, says, "David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab." Remember that this is during the time when Absalom is in rebellion against David. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa was the son of Jether, an Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. And the Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. Boy, what's this all about? Why are you giving me a history lesson here, Carlos? Well, it's interesting. Because Amasa was the son of Jether, an Ishmaelite who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. So this Abigail, this is not the Abigail who was the wife of David, right? This is Abigail, who is the daughter of Nahash and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. Well, let's go to 1 Chronicles 2. That's why sometimes, you go through some of these genealogies and you think, oh my goodness, you got these shopping lists, right? These laundry lists of things, and why do we even need this? Well, because sometimes it reveals some pretty interesting information. So if you go to 1 Chronicles 2, verse 9. First Chronicles 2, verse 9. The sons born to Hezron were Jerahmeel, Ram, and Caleb. Okay, so these are all Judah. This is from the line of Judah, and that's the Caleb that you see in the wilderness. And then it says in verse 10, Ram was the father of Aminadab, and Aminadab the father of Nahshon, the leader of the people of Judah. Nahshon was the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, and Obed the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of Eliab, his firstborn. The second son was Abinadab, the third Shemaiah, the fourth Nethanel, the fifth Radai, the sixth Ozem, and the seventh David. So we saw this in 1 Samuel 16, right? Although we didn't go through the whole chapter to see all the sons. Their sisters, whose sisters? Their sisters, Jesse's sister. Their sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail. Wait a minute, let me think here for a second here. Excuse me, no. Let me see here. Make sure I'm getting this right. His firstborn. The second son was Abinadab, the third Shemaiah, the fourth Nethanel, the fifth Radai, the sixth Otham, and the seventh David. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm right. Okay, so no, okay, that's why I'm getting confused. Sorry for the brain cramp. Not Jesse's sister, but these are all of his sons, right? Including David, and then their sisters. In other words, David's sister. Okay, so it's the sisters of Jesse's children, Jesse's sons. Their sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail. So this Abigail is a sister of David. Zeruiah's three sons were Abishai, Joab, and Asahel. And this is the same Joab who was a captain in David's army. Abigail was the mother of Amasa, whose father was Jether the Ishmaelite. Okay, so if David, what I'm getting at here, if David and his sister Abigail had the same father, then he is referred to as Nahash in 2 Samuel 17:25. And the reason I say that that's interesting is because the term Nahash means snake or serpent. So remember, talking about the characteristics of people, is it possible that Jesse was a sly or even maybe a deceitful type of man? We don't know anything else about him, but perhaps he had a characteristic that was very sly. So it's interesting in that we know of Solomon's wisdom that's given to him by Yahweh, that he uses that in a very benign way, right? In a very good way, very positive way, in accordance with the Torah. But does this run in the family? This slyness, this inclination towards cleverness. Okay, we should also note his grandfather on his mother's side, right? So that's grandfather on David's, on his father's side. But what about the grandfather on his mother's side? Well, we know from studying 2 Samuel 11:3 and 2 Samuel 23:34 that Bathsheba was the daughter of Eliam, right? So if you look just at one of these verses here, 2 Samuel 23, since we're there already, 2 Samuel 23:34. Eliphelet, son of Ahasbai, the Maachathite, Eliam, son of Ahithophel, the Gileonite, okay? And then that's Eliam, he's the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. Then look at 2 Samuel 11:3. That's the account of David's sin with Bathsheba, 2 Samuel 11:3. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. She's the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite, the daughter of Eliam. Who is Eliam? Eliam is son of Ahithophel. Who is Ahithophel? Ahithophel was Ahithophel the Gilonite, who was a trusted counselor to King David. Again, a very wise individual who eventually turned on David. Thank you. Who eventually turned on David. And Solomon has much to say. And by the way, if you look at 2 Samuel 15:2, it tells you, well, let's look at it. 2 Samuel 15:2. Uh, 15:12, sorry. 2 Samuel 15:12. Well, Absalom, remember, this is the time when Absalom went into direct rebellion against David. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. So this is the same Ahithophel that had been a very trusted counselor of King David, right? So what is my point with all this? Well, the point is to not ignore the context in which these things were written. They're not just popping out of nowhere, right? This the wisdom literature and the specific advice that's being given, the specific counsel, because remember, it's counsel based upon experience. So not only is he gaining much of this through what the learning that he gained from his mother and father, the learning that he gained perhaps from Jesse, the learning that he gained perhaps from Ahithophel, right? But also some of the instances that occurred in the direct course of their lives also influenced the types of things that he would teach. Ahithophel turned against King David, right? You know, David said that he who had bread at my table, and I'm paraphrasing, turned his way against me, right? He turned his heel against me. So, you know, these are things that don't happen outside of a particular context. This is Psalm 55:12. Psalm 55:12. David speaking, says, if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of Elohim, as we walked about among the worshipers, right? But David had some very, very close, intimate experiences with betrayal. The verse I was referring to before, paraphrasing somewhat badly, was Psalm 42. Psalm 42, Psalm 41, verse 9. Psalm 41, verse 9. Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me. Might he have been referring to Ahithophel? Don't know. But later on in Proverbs, you know, Solomon would have very specific things to say about men. Although he understood that wisdom came from Yahweh, he also understood that men would sometimes fail you. So you take, for example, Proverbs 28:25. It's all wisdom based on experience. Proverbs 28:25 says, the greedy stir up conflict, but those who trust in Yahweh will prosper. Proverbs 29:25 says, fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in Yahweh is kept safe. In other words, his emphasis was always more on trust of Almighty Yahweh rather than the trust of men. And Agur, same thing, 30 verse 5. Every word of Elohim is flawless. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. And you're going to see as we go through the Proverbs that there are many, many Proverbs that talk about dealing with deceitful men. Solomon speaks of the faithful wounds of a friend compared to the kisses of an enemy, for example, in Proverbs 27, verse 6. 27:6 says, wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. In other words, an enemy will kiss you as if they love you, but in the meantime, they're stabbing you in the back, right? So it's similar to what the kind of things that David said in Psalm 55. So Solomon followed in the tradition of Ahithophel to the extent that he gained his wisdom and counsel, but also he gained a healthy respect for the idea that men are not to be fully trusted. So Solomon was strongly influenced by teachings of his ancestors, both for good and bad. That's my ultimate point with all this. He was a faithful man who did not always learn from his parents' mistakes, right? For example, you see that David maintained a harem, and he also did, and it got him into some serious trouble later in life. So he gained some good things, he gained some bad things. In the book of Ecclesiastes, we see how he made some mistakes, right, that he wished he hadn't. But as a whole, Solomon's views on morality and the need to serve Yahweh were strongly inculcated in him as he was raised in Jerusalem. You know, the teachings, instruction, and guidance that he received as a young man combined to make of him an able and wise ruler. Solomon in his reign is remembered for three major things, right? As I mentioned at the beginning of the study, his wisdom, his skills as a great master builder and administrator, and as a prominent statesman, arms dealer, and trader of his time. And of course, he's remembered as being one of the wisest men that ever lived. In 1 Kings 3, Solomon he specifically asked Yahweh for wisdom. Remember, Yahweh asked him, what do you want me to give you? And he says, I want wisdom so that I can govern justly, right? This simplicity of heart led Yahweh to give him the wisdom that he requested, and in addition, wealth, prestige, and power. We know from the first 9 chapters of Proverbs that the wisdom that Solomon had was a combination of the understanding and discernment that Yahweh gave him and the wisdom given by his parents. So you see in Proverbs 2, 1-5, my son, if you will receive my words and lay up my commandments with you, so as to incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding, then shall you understand the fear of Yahweh and find the knowledge of Elohim, right? And Solomon, of course, in turn, taught his students, as he himself had learned, the fear of Yahweh. He expects his hearers as children, as spiritual children, to absorb those lessons in order to have a better communion with Yahweh. Okay, and there's more that can be said about Solomon, but I think that's plenty for the moment. Okay? So always understand that these influences are occurring in the mind of Solomon as he's going through and giving us these verses. Now, let's talk about 3 major things that are happening in the book of Proverbs. 3 major, I don't know if themes would be the right word, but 3 major lessons are important to take in the overall understanding of the book. Remember that Yahweh is guiding his people to lead productive lives in him. How are you going to lead a productive life? That's what the book of Proverbs answers. How do you lead a productive life? How do you lead a life that's honoring to Yahweh? And as I said last week, the book of Proverbs is not really a book directed, quite frankly, to non-believers. And the reason it's not really directed to non-believers is not because the same wisdom doesn't apply to them. Of course it does. But it almost assumes that these are people that the audience to whom it's addressed want to know Yahweh, want to know him better. And it describes the pitfalls of not seeking to know him, of seeking to remain in ignorance from a religious and moral standpoint, right? But it's not really directed towards those who don't want to know Yahweh. It's really directed toward those who do want to know Yahweh. And sometimes, people who may have gone astray and they're trying to come back to Yahweh. So it's for all mankind, very obviously. It's for everyone. But it's a special import to that person who truly wants to know Elohim. And there are 3 major things that we're going to learn in the book of Proverbs. And the first I've already alluded to, and that is to learn from those who have more experience in life. That's something that I'm afraid is in many ways in our present generation, it's not viewed with the same respect as it was in previous generations. At least that's my opinion. I don't know that people value the experience of others, the experience of those who came before them. There's so much to be said about that, and quite frankly, too much. I can go into a whole sermon here. I think I'm not going to do that. But, we really have to get back to an understanding of listening to those who came before us. They had something to say. They gained it in the trials and tribulations of life, and the challenges of life. Why go through the same things again and again when people have gone before you and know where the pitfalls are. It's foolishness. It's foolishness to not learn from those who came before you, both for good and for ill. Right? As a matter of fact, if you're a parent, you know that you want your children to have a better life than you did, or at least as good a life, right? You want your children to do as well or better, right? You want them to stand on your shoulders in terms of the good things and to, not hopefully follow the bad things. And the way that you get them to understand that is by communicating to them the things that have worked and the things that have not worked, right? And of course, if you're basing those upon the foundation of the word of Yahweh, even more so. So you want them to do better. Any parent who truly loves their child, right, wants the children to learn from their own mistakes and to do better. So that's a theme you're going to see repeated in different ways over and over in the book of Proverbs, learning from those who have more experience in life. When we talk about, and we won't do that in great detail today, but when we talk about the different types of fools that are described in the scriptures, and as I did last week, I'll allude to them today, right? You have the naive person who doesn't have wisdom, not because they don't want it, but because they just haven't lived, right? They just don't have the experience. And then you have the second type of fool, who is a fool who knows better. They do know, but they choose not to follow for whatever reason. Maybe they find it too difficult. Maybe they like the world too much, right? Maybe they like pleasures of the world too much, and they just don't want to, or they're lazy, right? But they know better. But they're still good-natured at heart. It's just that they're just not making the leap, right? They're just not, they're, for whatever reason, they don't internalize those things to the point that it drives them to action. And there's hope for a person like that, right? As there is for the naive person. But the third type of fool, really, really tough, really, really dangerous. That's the scoffer or the mocker. That's a person who knows better, but refuses to follow in it. The scoffer does not want to at all follow. And not only that, but they want to drag down and make fun of the people who do, right? That's the mocker. For that person, that's a really tough nut to crack, if that person can be cracked at all, right? So the second thing that's going through the book of Proverbs is choosing wisdom over foolishness or folly. And that is possible for the naive person. That's possible for the simple fool, right? For the careless fool. But it's very, very difficult for the scoffer or the mocker, right? The scoffer or the mocker is often referred to in the scriptures in Proverbs and elsewhere as, there's a term, a son of Belial. And it's often translated in the English as a worthless person. And by the way, that worthless is not in the sense of worthless in the sight of Yahweh, right? At least I don't believe that, okay? Because everyone has an inherent worth in the sight of Yahweh. But in their actions and in the way in which they're living, they are worthless to other people because they are not engaging in a way that is socially acceptable towards other people and that will benefit other people, but they're doing things just to benefit themselves. So they're worthless to society because of their actions, and they're going to continue to be worthless if they don't make changes, if they don't change their attitude and decide to walk in a way that's going to be conducive to a good society, right? So those folks are really tough to deal with. So the Proverbs makes a great, strong case, especially in the first 9 chapters, of choosing wisdom over foolishness, over folly. Folly means to despise, to spurn the way of wisdom. That's what folly means, right? And you see that there's another way, but you say to yourself, there's no way I'm going to follow that. Not important. Don't need it. Don't want it, etc. Right? And that's very, very dangerous. So Proverbs makes a very strong case throughout. Choose wisdom. And it shows you, if you don't choose wisdom, this is going to be the consequence. If you choose wisdom, this is going to be the blessing. But if you don't choose wisdom, this is going to be the consequence, and you're going to have to live with that consequence. Okay? And then the third thing you're going to see throughout the book of Proverbs is what I really took a lot of time last week to discuss, which is living a practical rather than a theoretical faith, right? It's one thing to know something intellectually. It's quite another to live it, to behave in that way. It's not enough, there are a lot of people that you run into that say, I know this, I know that, I know I shouldn't do this, I know I should do that. But what do they do with it, right? Talk is cheap. We all know that expression. And particularly with regards to wisdom, talk is cheap, right? It's the doers that actually achieve things in life. It's not those who are just simply talkers. You may be very, very well informed intellectually. You may be able to, write paragraphs and essays on, the virtues of doing good, whatever, right? But if you're not actually willing to apply those principles in your life to make the changes in your life, then they're really no good. I've run into people like this in my coaching over the years. I remember this one fellow in particular, a young fella, nice guy, loved him a lot. And, and this is a person who was a believer at one point, and he fell away from the faith. And I sat there in a car one day, one evening, speaking with him and going through different things with them. And I know, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Chapter and verse, he was quoting me. Chapter and verse. Hey, and this, and here's what it says here, and here's what it says there. And yes, but then no action whatsoever, because it was intellectually good for him. It was a great intellectual exercise, and it played to a sense of significance, I sensed, for him to be able to spout out all the right answers, right? But the point was, how was that having an impact in your life? Was it having an impact in his life? And the answer clearly was no. And to this day, he's still wandering aimlessly out there. Now, you know what? That's his business, right? I can't tell him one way or the other, and it's not my place to go and to try to force him. But if he wants to make changes in his life in a positive sense, that has to come from a decision that he makes to put those things into action. Doesn't matter that he knows them intellectually. It doesn't matter. It has to be brought out into action. And the Book of Proverbs emphasizes that practical aspect rather than the theoretical faith. So as I've learned the Book of Proverbs, these lessons all have made a strong impression on me because they've encouraged me to modify my own routine to include the study of Proverbs regularly for counsel on a daily basis. King Solomon left us this practical guide that helps us in the day-to-day. And by the way, I won't go into this topic deeply because I want to move on to other things, but keep one other thing in mind. We also all believe, don't we, that we are in training for a future time in the kingdom of Yahweh, right? You go to 1 Peter 2, verse 9. What does Peter tell us? 1 Peter 2, verse 9. He says, speaking to those who are serving Yahweh, he says, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, Elohim's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of Elohim. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. A chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. It's similar to what you find over in Exodus 19. If we're living lives that are leading to us having, what I'm getting at is lives that are leading to us having leadership positions in the kingdom of Yahweh. Yahweh's preparing people to train this earth in all of his ways, because the world has frankly gone in all kinds of incorrect directions. And if he's training us for that, how is he training us? He's training us through his word. He's training us through his wisdom. So that wisdom is not only wisdom to be able to live now, but it's also wisdom that's going to help us to train others in a future age. So don't lose sight of that, right? We're gonna know not only for the here and now, but also moving on into the future. Now, let's talk a little bit more as we start going into the first chapter here, and we'll certainly do that next time. But from the very outset of the Book of Proverbs and in subsequent chapters, I'm going to talk about each of these three major themes, right? So we're talking about the first one, which is learning from individuals with greater experience in life. Remember last week I went through all these different definitions? We're going to go through those in great detail as we go verse by verse. But I want to focus on this word chokmah, number 2451 in the Hebrew dictionary, chokmah. The word means wisdom, and it implies the wisdom that comes from experience. Proverbs 1 verse 5 says this. It's giving you the reasons why the book of Proverbs was written. It says, let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. Some other versions say that one of the purposes is so that the man of understanding may attain to sound counsels. The man of understanding, so the person already has understanding, but because he has understanding, he realizes how much he really doesn't know, right? He always wants to know more because he knows that it's not enough what he knows. He knows that he has to continually learn so that he can improve his life. The person who serves Yahweh always wants to make improvements in their lives. They always want to elevate their standards. How are you doing with that these days, my friends? Are you seeking to elevate your standards, or are you content to just kind of be at the same level that you're always, in which you always find yourself? If you're not elevating your standards, there's something wrong there. Servants of Yahweh should always be seeking to know more about how to serve him better, how to serve others better. And for that, we have to be willing to elevate our standards. And the book of Proverbs helps that person of understanding, that's you, that's me, attain to sound counsels. And the term counsels here is the word takbula. And the word is number 8458, 8458, takbula. This is interesting. It means steerage, kind of like as a management of ropes, using ropes like on a ship for steerage. Very interesting. Managing ropes is figurative, right? It's the word means figuratively guidance. So the Proverbs help the man of understanding to attain sound guidance, sound counsels, and that guidance is like ropes that are helping you to steer a ship. This is an important concept, in that the sound counsel consists of advice from people who are older and more experienced. Don't we know the expression? Don't we even use the expression in, what is the expression that we use in English about ropes, right? Right, when it talks about knowing the person of experience, we say you have to learn the ropes, right? Isn't that what we say? But this is where this concept comes from. Learning the ropes means that you learn from someone who knows, who's been there, someone who's already steered the ship. He knows how to steer it left. He knows how to steer it right. So you go to someone who knows the ropes. It conveys the competence of experienced individuals who are able to guide the young in morality and other aspects of life. That's what that first concept is all about, right? So one such group we already alluded to today when we talked about Solomon. One such group of people is one's parents. And references abound in Proverbs to both mother and father. And I have a bunch of verses here, but I already read some of those earlier. It made a strong impression on me as I started to learn about the Proverbs to see how Solomon makes repeated allusions to the teaching of children by their parents. My son, don't forget this. My son, remember this. My son, keep this in mind, etc. A child's parents, as I said earlier, are the closest ones to him and are therefore responsible for teaching him moral behavior. And it's especially true that the mother is normally the one most closely tied to that child in the early years. So a lot depends on her. Consequently, she's going to do all that she can to instill good values in that child. And that provides a rock-solid foundation in good living, which the father supplements by the voice of authority. So he also teaches, but he teaches in another way. He is more often than not the disciplinarian, right? Although the mother will do some discipline as well. But oftentimes the father has that stronger hand where he's going to discipline, and I don't necessarily mean in terms of corporal punishment, although that also is biblically sanctioned, right? If it's done the right way and not in a way that is abusive, of course, right? But even just with the moral voice of authority, if the father is following in the example of Yahweh and living a moral life and a life of integrity, the child is also going to see that and is going to copy that because the father is modeling it as the mother also models it. And over time, the child is going to become less dependent and will be able to make his or her own decisions according to the word of Yahweh that was taught them. Okay. The early chapters of Proverbs serve as an introduction to the remainder of the book. There are various definitions given, and as I said, we'll get into them, and reasons concerning the need for wisdom in order to establish righteousness, justice, and equity in the mind and heart of the hearer. And that's especially prominent in the first 6 verses of chapter 1. But indeed, the first 9 chapters in particular are crucial in establishing the tone for the rest of the proverbial presentations. And in these early chapters, you're going to see very, very prominently in the early chapters, it's kind of like emulating life, right? In the early chapters of a child's life, the mother and father are prominent. So too, in the book of Proverbs, the early chapters are mother, father, right? And it leads and it builds until later life. And it's just, Yahweh's word is beautiful, the way it's crafted, because the later chapters then go from the mother and father leading forward to the words of the wise, right? And the words of the wise are those people that come later in a person's life who continue in the tradition of the parents, teaching them because of their own experience as well, right? So this is the teachers and the authority figures and others who also add to the teaching of the parents and reinforce what the parents have done, right? So that you can continue to build upon that early foundation and become a very wise person. And it's interesting that we wind up ending the book of Proverbs back with the instruction, the original instruction of who? The mother. Very interesting. Okay. So in the early chapters, the father clearly speaks to the son, but it can also be a teacher speaking to his students. It can have that connotation as well, because teachers in ancient Israel were wise individuals, as I said, who served as extensions of the parents to their students. Teachers, parents, judges, and others were strong voices speaking wisdom and moral authority in the community because they wanted to guide society to a moral way of life. It was not just good for the individual, but for the whole society, for the whole community, because a society is composed of individuals. So if you have immoral individuals in a society, it's gonna corrupt the entire community, right? So you want to teach one by one, person by person, right? So that the entire society can benefit. So they sought to train people to have good characters, and they were especially concerned for the young, right? Both temporally and spiritually speaking. Young people in particular tend to be susceptible to worldly influences until they can learn discipline and stand on their own 2 feet. And that's not meant to be condescending. It's just a fact of life. I went through it, right? I'm in my 50s now, but I was once in my teens and then in my 20s. And it's just a fact of life that when you have less experience, you do not have the benefit of hindsight. You have a lot of theory, right? And you're listening to people with different types of theories, some good and some not so good. But you yourself have very little experience by which to go. So sometimes you have to go through some hard knocks and some difficult experiences so that you can test the water, so to speak, and hopefully you don't make any major mistakes along the way. But young people in particular tend to be susceptible. There's a pair of writers, they're scholars, Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart. If you remember a book that I have used in the past called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And there are other variations, How to Read the Bible book by book. There are other books that they did as well. Those are the authors, Fee and Stewart. One of them, I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Gordon Fee, who was an editor for the New International Version. But very, very wise men in terms of scholarship. They wrote in one of the books, I want to say let's see now. Yeah, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. They wrote this. This is a direct quote from them about this topic about the younger students. We note that the wise person served as a sort of substitute parent to the person seeking wisdom from him or her. Even before the Exodus, Joseph was made by Yahweh a father to Pharaoh, right? Quote unquote, a father to Pharaoh. You find that in Genesis 45:8. And later the prophetess Deborah is called a mother in Israel, Judges 5:7. Thus, often in the book of Proverbs, we see the wise teacher addressing his or her pupil as my child or my son. Parents sent their children to be educated in wisdom attitudes and lifestyles from such wisdom teachers. And these teachers taught their pupils as they would their own children. And that's end of quote. Now, second thing, the distinction between the way of wisdom and the way of folly. Proverbs consistently makes a distinction between the wise man and the fool. The chokum, which is a derivative of the word chokmah, the wise man, the chokum, is sharply contrasted to the fool. As I said, there are different words for fool, one of them being stupid or silly, the kasil, right? This contrast is especially evident in the first 9 chapters of the book. Solomon repeatedly draws our attention to the different attitudes of the fool as compared to the wise man. Wisdom begins with the fear of Yahweh and moves out into the whole range of life. Wisdom begins with the fear of Yahweh, and we'll talk a lot more about that, but it begins with a healthy respect and reverence and awe for our Heavenly Father. If you don't believe that the source is who He is, then the rest of it kind of rings hollow, right? Because if wisdom is just coming from men, then, it's only as good as the particular man from which you're receiving it. But if the ultimate source of that wisdom is a holy Elohim, that puts a much different take on it, right? Because then you know that the ultimate source is not just the whim of some man, right? It's a holy Elohim who loves his children and provided a written record for us with the attitudes that he wants for us to adopt. So wisdom begins with that fear and moves out into every aspect of life. Folly is not ignorance, right? Folly is not ignorance, because you could be ignorant and still moving towards wisdom. Matter of fact, the naive person is like that, right? They're ignorant. Ignorant is not a bad word. Ignorant is just a fact of life, right? We are ignorant of something until we know. We're all ignorant of something. There are many things of which I'm ignorant as we speak. There are many things that I will be ignorant of by the time I die, right? And some things, many things I choose to be ignorant of because I just don't have a place for it in my life for whatever reason, right? But when it comes to the ways of wisdom, you don't want to be ignorant of those ways. Folly is not ignorance. So folly is something different. Folly is the deliberate disdain of moral and righteous principles, the rejection of moral and righteous principles. You say, I don't need that. That's for other people. That's not for me. Don't need it. The wise man loves wisdom and seeks to learn more each day. And more importantly, his wisdom and understanding originates from a deep-seated desire to serve Almighty Yahweh and to do his will, right? That's really what's at the heart of it. What is that? That's the beginning of wisdom, which is the fear of Yahweh. If you don't fear Yahweh, it's not going to matter, right? But if you truly want to know who your Elohim is and what it is that he wants for your life, you're going to take that into account. You're going to take that to heart. Learning is habit forming, and the wise will make an effort to truly comprehend the words that will enable him to be delivered from those evil inclinations that we have to deal with, right? So you have to form a habit for wisdom. That's why I said to you, you have a standing homework week after week from this point forward, and that is that you every day should be in the Book of Proverbs, every single day. If you choose not to do that, then, I can't help you, right? Because you are choosing to not do something that is going to help you in your life. You're telling me that you don't have 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day to consume a little bit of wisdom. If you can't consume that little bit of wisdom, one chapter of Proverbs a day is conveniently packaged, right? In our system, in our calendar system, 30 days, 31 days, right? Convenient, 31 chapters of Proverbs, 30 at a minimum 30 and a maximum 31 days in a month, perfectly packaged, right? Just on a 30-day month, you just read 2 chapters on the last day. Very easy, very simple, very straightforward. Right? If you don't have time to go through 1 chapter of Proverbs a day, how will you ever grow? If you're not willing to put just that minimal effort, that doesn't make any sense to me, right? Looking for wisdom is habit forming, and the wise are going to make an effort to truly comprehend the words that will enable them to be delivered from the evil inclination. Now, there are many types of fools, just to show you the starkest of contrasts, but the scoffer in particular is the really dangerous one, right? Because the scoffer is prudent in his own sight. The scoffer lives to tear down others. He's morally deficient, and he often brings trouble upon himself. Notice, he's intellectually capable of understanding the truth, but he chooses not to do so because he loves his weakness. He's out for himself. He simply does not want to change. It's just that simple. Ultimately, since misery loves company, it's not enough that he doesn't want to do it. He also seeks to drag others along the road of folly with him as he turns away from Yahweh. He's a son of Belial, and is a worthless and a base person who delights in casting off the yoke of Yahweh's Torah and the responsibility that goes with it. And by the way, that's manifested in his speech, right? His speech is not straight compared to the plain words of the righteous, and he manifests through his speech a heart that is wicked. He sows discord, disagreement, disunion, right? Disunity. He sows discord among people. He typifies the 7 things that Yahweh hates, Proverbs 6:16-19. And again, I'm giving you the most extreme example to see where a rejection of wisdom can lead, right? A lot of people thankfully don't fall into the definition of scoffer. They're somewhere in between the naive, the simple, right? And the fool, who is the one who knows better but just isn't complying, right? So it's important to understand that you're going to want one as compared to the other. You don't want to be somewhere in between. Wisdom cries out to be heard in the Book of Proverbs. That's significant. It's personified as crying out to be heard, right? It's making an appeal. Listen to me. You're going to see that very distinctly, especially in Proverbs 1:20 to 33 and in Proverbs 8 and 9. Wisdom cries out, come here. You don't have to be simple. You don't have to be foolish. You can know wisdom. Come on. I'm here. I'm here for the taking. I'm open. I'm here freely. Come and drink freely. But many people will choose not to do it. It admonishes us to make a distinction between right and wrong, between good and evil. In the first chapter, we're urged to develop discernment. That's that word binah that I described last week. To choose between this and this. To comprehend the difference between right and wrong. And then to make choices. This teaches us the ability to grasp values and a set of principles in order to develop a character that is illustrative of a mature spiritual adult. Do we want to be mature spiritual adults? Do we want to be people of character? Do we want to be people of integrity? Do we want to be people that have a very strong set of values? I am so convinced that we live in an age where values are so off base. It's so off. Because it's a semblance of values. It's not even true values. In other words, it's kind of like a judge's condition, not that bad yet, except in certain quarters, but it's kind of a condition where everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Yeah, your way is as good as my way, and that way is as good as this way, and you can't impose your values on me, and you can't impose your morality on me, and you can't impose your vision of right and wrong, your definition of right and wrong on me, because right and wrong are subjective, and it depends on the view. It's in the eye of the beholder, etc., etc. Well, I just don't believe that. I don't believe that because I believe in Yahweh's word, and I believe that the source of Yahweh's word is Yahweh himself. And if I believe that, then by definition, I can't believe that everything is relative. I can't believe that. And there are many people out there, decent-minded people who believe that, and I understand that. And I see where they're coming from, but I just have to agree to disagree because I believe in the source of truth and the source of wisdom. And that source has given us his word. It's also particularly interesting to note the contrast in Proverbs 9 as the simple hears the voice of the foolish, the strange woman, which leads to death, while the wise man hears the voice of wisdom simultaneously crying out to be heard and obeyed. And those voices are typically simultaneous, right? Wisdom is crying out on the one hand, come over here, don't go in that direction. And then foolishness is on the other one. And the fool is on the other hand, saying, no, come and let's do this and let's do that. And don't worry, it's all relative. And nobody has an angle on truth. And truth is not really truth. It's, it all depends on the person that's viewing it. Well, we all decide, brothers and sisters. We all have a decision to make. And if we choose, we either choose wisdom or we don't. And if we don't choose wisdom, you're still making a choice, right? If you don't act at all, and you just let life happen to you, and you make decisions on the basis of whatever as life goes on, you've still made a choice, right? Because you haven't deliberately pursued wisdom. And you're going to have to live with the consequences of that choice. And yes, you have every right to make that choice. You're adults. I can't tell you what to do. But I can point out the consequences if you don't follow wisdom. And that's what the Book of Proverbs does. It points out the consequences if you don't follow wisdom. It makes a very clear distinction between following wisdom and not. And then related to that, but lastly, Proverbs teaches that practical rather than a theoretical wisdom, right? It's a wisdom that's intended to teach the young to look forward, to have prudence, and to develop self-discipline, responsibility, and ultimately self-reliance in life. The Proverbs that are set forth, as I described last week, are short, earthy statements. They're portable truth. Remember that? It's easier to give you a short, illustrative, picture, word picture, than to explain, a bunch of principles in narrative. They're short, earthy statements that are easily understood and remembered that communicate certain behavioral, moral, and spiritual truths. Now, bear in mind that the Hebrew mind was based and founded upon reality, right? The here and now, not philosophy and abstractions. The wisdom teachers used Proverbs precisely because the incisive, down-to-earth statements could be handily learned and absorbed by students who would commit them to memory, right? They're comparisons, remember. It's like Proverbs 25:28. Proverbs 25:28 says, like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. Like a city whose walls, a comparison, like this, it's like that, right? A person who lacks self-control is like a city whose walls are broken through. So I can tell you, I can explain in a very academic, professorial way about, well, a person has to have self-control so that they can be, they can be orderly and right and all that, right? But you're not going to really, it's not memorable. But if you remember, a city whose walls are broken through, and you can vision it, the city. Now, in our day, it's a little bit tougher to imagine that, right? Because we don't live in cities with walls, right? That's more of an ancient concept where you have a city that's surrounded by walls. But for a person at that time, of course, it was a very vivid picture. A city with the walls broken. Oh yes, I understand that. It's out of control. The person who doesn't have self-control, wow. Like a city without walls, unprotected. In other words, I'm open to all kinds of influences. I'm open to all kinds of enemies. That's what the idea was going to get. So maybe you don't view things today in terms of walls. Remember, we're looking at principles. What if I said to you, okay, a country without borders? A person without self-control is like a country without borders. Maybe that's a little bit more appropriate in our day and age, right? What is a country without borders? It's open to attack. It's open to people coming in, terrorists and others who seek to do us harm. So if that word picture helps you better, use that word picture. Maybe we don't have cities with walls, but we have countries with borders, right? So think of it that way, and it's the picture that you bring to mind readily. If I don't have self-control, it's like opening the country to just anybody. It's opening the country of my mind to any influences that are going to come in, you see. It's practical wisdom. The wisdom teachers use this so that there will be lessons that will easily be absorbed by students who would commit them to memory. When faced with difficult choices to make in life, the student would be able to recall these lessons learned and make the proper judgment with relative ease. Because now you know, I remember seeing something about self-control. What was that? Yes, the city without walls. And then and I'm not just using that one example, but there are many. You're going to see as we go through it. I'll point them out to you as we go through the Book of Proverbs. Many examples, right? I mean, I gave one example last week about the lazy person, right? The lazy person won't even lift up the mouth won't even lift his hand to the mouth. So, they'll do enough to go ahead and, wipe the plate, but then they just kind of sit there. They're too lazy to even lift a morsel to their mouths. That's a much more memorable picture than saying, a lazy person doesn't do anything, right? A lazy person won't even lift the thing. The lazy person says, there's a lion in the streets. I'm not going to do that. There's a lion in the streets. I can get killed by a lion. In other words, he's making excuses. It's much easier to say, to remember, the lazy person, he's afraid. He's fearful. He thinks there's a lion in the streets. He's making up the lion in the streets. It's a vivid word picture, you see. So unlike the pagan cultures, the Proverbs in Israel meant nothing if they did not ultimately lead to glorifying our Heavenly Father Yahweh. It wasn't just an intellectual exercise. These are not intellectual statements so that you can use them at parties, right? These are statements for you to use in the day-to-day that are going to tell you about what it means to stay away from violence. That's going to tell you how to stay away from sexual immorality. That's going to tell you how to keep from saying things that you're going to regret, right? That's going to tell you how to treat your fellow men. How do you treat your mother and father? How do you make business decisions that are ethical, right? So that you don't wind up doing something where you're going to be in trouble with the law. How do you pick the right sorts of friends? Are these not practical things that we need to know in our lives? Of course they are. And the Proverbs are full of them. It goes through all of these topics and then some, right? Following wisdom leads to a productive, moral life and therefore a better life. Proverbs strongly warn students against certain prevalent temptations such as crimes of violence, hasty pledges, laziness, dishonesty, and especially sexual immorality. Life is a system of judging. Understand that. You're making decisions every single day, right? When I talked about the emotional triad that was popularized by Tony Robbins, it's three things that constitute our emotional state at any given moment. What are they? Focus, physiology, and language. What do I mean by that? Focus. You're always choosing something to focus on. What are you choosing to focus on each day? Each day you're saying, I'm going to focus on this problem, this issue, whatever. And you're giving that a certain meaning. And what meaning are you giving that thing? And it's going to make a difference if it's a negative meaning as compared to a positive meaning. And the language that you use to describe that thing is going to be different, right? It's going to be important because it's going to determine whether you pursue something that's good or bad, something that's harmful, helpful, because of the way in which you speak of it. So a person who's always speaking negatively about things is going to be doing negative things because it only follows naturally. And then physiology, your physiology, how you conduct yourself, how you bear yourself up, it's going to make a difference also. If you're always, what does the scripture talk about a person who's deceitful? They're winking the eye, right? They're shuffling the feet, they're pointing with their fingers, right? Making little signs and symbols, right? Because they're using the physiology in a certain way to get people to do certain things in a trickster sort of way, right? So all these things, focus. What are you focusing on? The meaning that you're giving. What is the language that's coming out of your mouth, both positive and negative? How are you using your body in order to get things accomplished? All those things are going to determine your emotions, how you think about things, right? And how you feel about things. And then therefore the direction of what you do, your actions, is going to influence your actions, right? Life is a system of judging, of focusing on something, giving it a certain meaning, and then pursuing that thing, of discerning between this or that. It's incumbent upon each of us to make good decisions. We have to actively work at elevating our lives above the level of immorality and spiritual wickedness that surrounds us, right? Because in this world, chaos is what prevails, no? Think about it. If we don't have active behavior, if we don't engage in active things, the world will act upon us. Proverbs shows you how to take action, how to act upon the world rather than allow the world to act upon you. If you allow the world to act upon you unchallenged, it will take you in directions that you don't want to go. It will lead you by its current to places where you don't want to go. If you don't actively move towards a certain path, you're going to be directed to another path. And that path is going to lead you to results and consequences that you're going to regret later. And this is what Proverbs shows you. And you know what? We all think that we're going to beat the odds, that we're going to be different. You're not, and you don't. You're not different, and you will not defeat the odds. Because we're all human beings, and because there are patterns that are proven throughout all of history. So you're not going to be the one exception to the rule. If you start going in a certain direction towards dishonest decisions in business, you will wind up doing something criminal. If you continue to follow some immoral, pursuit, you will wind up committing an act of immorality. If you continue to treat people in a way that is neglectful and that is abusive, it will lead you to ruined relationships. It's inevitable. You're not going to be the exception to the rule. I promise you. I don't care how smart you are. I don't care how old you are, how many years you've lived. There are many 70, 80-year-old people who have major regrets in life because they didn't make the right decisions in their lives. And there are people in prison right now who are in their 70s and 80s who made terrible decisions later in life. Look at the Bernie Madoffs of the world, right? He's not that old, but he's going to be by the time he finishes his sentence and then some, right? Because people, it's not about your age necessarily. It's not about how long you've lived. It's not about, that doesn't impress me. That certainly doesn't impress Yahweh. It's what are you doing with the knowledge and the wisdom that's coming your way when you're young, when you're old, etc. You could be doing things right all your life, and then in later years, you can decide to throw caution to the wind and then begin to make foolish decisions. It's not contingent upon age. It's contingent upon attitude. It's contingent upon desire. It's contingent upon will. It's contingent upon intention. What is your intention? Is it to love and serve Yahweh? Is it to love and serve your neighbor? Or is it to love and serve yourself? Those are the things that are going to make all the difference. And the book of Proverbs will help you to work actively in the right direction so that you act against entropy, so that you act against chaos, so that you act in ways that are going to lead you to a correct path, that are going to give you a correct outcome, right? We do our part to edify the body of Messiah, which is a haven for the righteous, but each of us also must be a captain of one to order our lives. It starts with you. It starts with me. Okay? And it should be noted finally that the blessings of instructions, that in addition to the blessing of instructions for daily living, Proverbs provides instruction in leadership, as I said. for future reference, right? Not just future, but also now. If you know the tenets of the Book of Proverbs, you're going to be a pretty good leader now too. And that leadership doesn't necessarily mean that you're leading politically or in government or in a corporation. It could be leading in your home. It could be leading in a certain project that you're working on, right? So you really want to pay close attention to these proverbs because it's going to help you in all those ways. Okay, let's take a look in the final minutes here at those charts one more time. And so I'll give me a moment here and I'll bring them on screen. And then Yahweh willing, with this nice foundation, and hopefully you have a better understanding of some of this in terms of the overall structure, and then we can begin with next week's session to delve into verse-by-verse analysis of the Book of Proverbs. So let me turn to the charts. So just, I think last week I went to the dates, but let me just show you that very quickly here. So you should see on screen the chart that shows the dates. And let me turn this around a little bit so you can see it better. Okay, so I think this way looks pretty good. Let me just increase that a little bit. Okay, so if you look at this chart, just as a reminder, and I'll get my little pointer here too. So here's where Solomon reigned, okay? And he would have reigned between 971 and 931 or thereabouts. And many of the proverbs, most of the proverbs were written during this period of time. And then you had a period of about 200 years that encompassed the periods of the kings of Israel and Judah up to the point where Israel went into captivity, the northern kingdom of Israel in 722. They went into Assyrian captivity, and then Judah went into Babylonian captivity around 586 BCE. And around 700, around the reign of Hezekiah, right about here, okay, you see right here, King Hezekiah, that's when the collection of Proverbs, of Solomon's Proverbs by the men of Hezekiah, the court scribes of Hezekiah, would have occurred, okay? And then there were other wise men during this period of time that would have also contributed. And by the way, the wise men, as I said, were probably court scribes, the court scribes of Hezekiah's time. The wise men are described in a number of places. Let me just give you a little description here of that. So if you look, for example, at 1 Kings 4:31, it describes some of the wise men of Solomon's time. 1 Kings 4. And we'll start reading with verse 29, 1 Kings 4:29. Elohim gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. That's pretty explicit. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. And interestingly, well, I'll tell you about that in a minute. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. Notice this, he spoke 3,000 proverbs, Solomon. 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. So you have a little catching up to do. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. So he was pretty well versed. He didn't just speak about religious things, right? He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. But notice this description of some other wise men: Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman, Calcol, Darda, right? Interestingly enough, just hold your place there and go to Psalm 89. So if you look at Psalm 89, they usually give you these superscriptions where they tell you, this is a Psalm of David, a Psalm of the sons of Korah. This one is a maskil of Ethan the Ezrahite. Oh, Ethan the Ezrahite. That's interesting. Who do we see in 1 Kings 4:31? Ethan the Ezrahite. And these other folks here as well, I don't have the particular verse at the moment, but there are others who are listed, and one of the things they have in common is that it appears that they may have been Levites, right? Who were the poets of Israel. They were teachers in Israel, and they were also the ones who were the songwriters because they did the temple service, right? So, and certainly that's true of Ethan the Ezrahite, who we see described here. So we'll talk more about those as we get to those sections, to 22:17 and 24. But I said I was going to mention something about the wisdom of Egypt. Well, the section of Proverbs that is referred to in, and let me get the chart here. 25 to 29. So if you go to Proverbs 25, it talks about the collection, right? These are more Proverbs of Solomon compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. Okay, that's Proverbs from 25 to 29. The scribes, they were exactly that. It doesn't say that they composed them, right? So don't make that mistake of thinking that the men of Hezekiah actually wrote the Proverbs. They didn't. It doesn't say that. It says that they compiled these Proverbs of Solomon. And when you look at the text here, and we'll get to all these in more detail when we get to those sections, but it's interesting to note that many of those Proverbs from 25 to 29 look like Proverbs that were in Egypt. There was a guy by the name of, I want to say Amenophi, or Amenopi, or Menem, I forget his name exactly, but there was an Egyptian king, and there were a lot of Proverbs that look similar to these. So of course, there are some scholars that say, oh, these were just Egyptian Proverbs that, that were just changed and put in here. Now, it's not necessarily that. Solomon may have adopted these. There may be an element of truth to that. He may have adopted those particular Proverbs and put a spin on them so that he could correct them and put them in line with the word of Yahweh. Okay? So you have those from 25 to 29 that are, it's very possible because of Solomon's interaction with Egypt. We don't have to, fear that or somehow spin that away. He was in contact with other wise men from throughout the world. Why not borrow some of those things and tweak them so that you could change them into something that makes more sense in accordance with the word of Yahweh? So when you see things like that, don't get flustered by that. Just understand that Yahweh uses, the whole earth is Yahweh's, and anything that comes as an inspiration, truth is truth, and Yahweh can take someone's, incorrect thing and turn it into something correct. So just understand that this structure exists. So this chart here gives you a bit of a sense of the timeline, the time frame. So you're talking about a roughly 200-year period from the time that Solomon wrote his Proverbs to the time that everything was collected into one final collection, about a 200-year period. And it probably would have ended around 200 or so before the Common Era. Okay, not 200 or so. I'm sorry. 200 years later, around 700. If you look at the chart here, around 700 Common Era. By that time, most of the Proverbs were probably compiled into the form that we see them today. So let me stop sharing this chart and let me go to one of the others. Let's see here if I have. Okay, let me get rid of some of these here because I have too many things on screen. Just bear with me for a second as I get rid of some of these. Oops. Okay, so let me share this screen here. So this is the survey by Irving Jensen. Last week we took a look at Chuck Swindoll's. So you should see this on screen now. And let me increase it just a bit. Okay, so hopefully everybody sees that. So looking at Jensen's chart, notice the way he broke it down, right? So he has, let me see if I can get a pointer here. So I don't know. Let's see here. Instead of a highlighter. Oh, I know. Okay, in the wrong place. Annotate and arrow. There we go. All right. So hopefully you're seeing this arrow come across here. So notice the chapter breakdown. So he starts 1:1, right? The first 6 verses of that the introduction that I mentioned earlier. And then starting around 1:7, you have a continuation of that overall introduction. So he breaks it down into different sections, right? Where he's talking about my son, right? Because it's more speaking like a father to a son. And then around chapter 8, wisdom comes into full force for 2 chapters. 8 and 9 are all wisdom speaking, wisdom personified. And then beginning with chapter 10, verse 1 are the actual Proverbs of Solomon. And notice how he has 10 through 15 emphasized with the word but. You guys see that? And then starting with chapter 16, emphasizing the word and. It's because the predominant term used from chapters 10 through 15 is but, indicating that contrastive type of proverb, what we call antithetical. Remember I described that last week? You have 3 different types. You have antithetical proverbs that are kind of opposites, right? Let me find you an example of each of these so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So just bear with me a minute. So you have the antithetical, which is an opposite point of view. And that's what you're seeing here in chapters 10 through 15 predominantly, okay? But I'll give you an example from Proverbs 3:33. So Proverbs 3:33 says, Yahweh's curse is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the righteous, right? Antithetical, opposing views. If you're wicked, you can expect Yahweh's curse. If you're righteous, you can expect Yahweh's blessing, right? Antithetical, but. Then from 16 through 22:16, the emphasis is on and that is that what we call synonymous parallelism. Synonymous. Remember parallel because it's side by side, right? So antithetical, the first example. The second, synonymous, where you are taking the second line to restate the first line, but in a different way, usually with synonyms. That's why it's synonymous parallelism, so that you reinforce the meaning of the proverb, right? So an example of this is actually found in Proverbs 1, verse 8. Proverbs 1:8, it says, listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Synonymous. My son, listen to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Father's instruction, mother's teaching, right? Both of them are important, okay? And then you have the third type of parallelism, which is synthetic, which uses the second or third line to advance the first line and complete the sense of the first. So in other words, the first verse contains the basic thought, but then you enhance it, you make it stronger by the second line or the third line. That's called synthetic parallelism. In other words, you're synthesizing a stronger argument, right? So if you think of antithesis, antithesis, right? Antithesis, you're doing opposes, anti. Then you're talking synonymous, same, but just stated differently, right? And then synthesis, you're building a stronger argument. You're synthesizing a stronger argument. Like Proverbs 3, verse 12. That's an example of synthetic parallelism. Proverbs 3, verse 12. Because Yahweh disciplines those he loves, as a father the son he delights in. For whom Yahweh loves, another way stated, for whom Yahweh loves, he corrects, just as a father, the son in whom he delights. So Yahweh loves those he corrects, corrects those he loves is the basic idea. And to make it stronger, hey, it's just like a father who corrects a son he delights in. You see, Yahweh loves you, so he corrects you. Like a father loves his son, it makes it stronger. Like a father corrects the son in whom he delights, that's the same way Yahweh loves you, is the idea. Okay? So you see these main three types of parallelism in the scriptures. So looking back to Jensen's chart, you see that Solomon's Proverbs from 10 to 15 strongly emphasize the antithetic type, the but, and then 16 to 22:16 emphasize the and, which could be synthetic or synonymous. Okay? And then you go to 22:17, which begins the words of the wise, and that goes through the end of 24. And then you have the collection of Hezekiah's men from 25 to 29. And then you have the words of Agur in chapter 30, the words of Lemuel in 31. Okay? Notice the overall ideas he has here. So he has the theme of Proverbs going from 1:1 through chapter 9. And then he has miscellaneous applications going from 10:1 through the end of the book. He views chapter 1, verse 1, all the way through 22:16 as dealing with Proverbs of Solomon. I'm not so sure that I would have done it that way, but I understand. And then he has everything from 22:17 onward, broken down according to the groups of men who put them together. Okay. Then he has 1:1 through 1:6 as a prologue. And then he has all the maxims from 1:7 all the way to chapter 30, in which case from 30 to 31, you have an epilogue, right? Now, I would have begun the maxims probably at chapter 10. That would be me if I were doing this chart. I would consider the prologue 1:1 to 1:6, and then 1:7 through 1:7 through chapter 9. I would include that as an introduction, or as laying the or as a foundation to the maxims. Okay, but that's me. And then he gives you the purposes of the Proverbs at the bottom. You know, and of course, it's very arbitrary according to the way he views it, right? But he views 1:1 through 9. He views that as personification being prominent and commendation. In other words, commending wisdom as compared to folly. So folly, you don't want to be a fool. You want to be wise. That's a commendation. The commendation of wisdom, and the main way that that's done is personification. Hey, listen to me. I'm crying out in the gates. I'm crying out of the tops of the rooftops and in the, all over the place. Listen to me. He's commending wisdom to us. And then he's observing how wisdom is actually implemented in our lives through one-verse maxims in all of Solomon's Proverbs from 10:1 to 22:16, observation, right? And then it gets a little bit more heavy, right? When he talks about exhortation and warning in the words of the wise. And then the words of Hezekiah's men, or the words of Solomon, more appropriately collected by Hezekiah, are more a comparison, right? This is the way of wisdom, this is the way of foolishness, and this is how it compares, right? These are comparisons. And then a description of wisdom working in people's lives, chapters 30 and 31. So you think about the worthy woman, which is the majority of the chapter in chapter 31, and that's a very, very detailed description of how a wise woman looks, what a wise woman looks like, right? Then at the very bottom, he has that the first 9 chapters are especially for youth. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I understand it. And then everything from about 8 forward, actually, for all. Excuse me. Notice that he has, let's see if I can flip this a little bit so you can see it better. And then we'll pretty much close up here. Okay, hold on. Let me undo this. The annotation, okay. So I will rotate this. I guess I should have done it counterclockwise. Okay, and let me lower it just a little bit so you can see it. At the top, he has keywords. actually over here. Wisdom, these are keywords throughout the book. Wisdom, knowledge, instruction, fear of Yahweh, right? Folly, life, but, law, commandments, righteous, evil, justice, my son, really key terms rather than words, right? And then key verses 1:7 and 9:10 that talk about wisdom, right? So this is a pretty good chart that gives you an overall view. And as I said, you can find these charts on the Facebook site. I posted them last week, and you can pull them up and you can print them off, or you can save them on your computer, and you can use them at any point, okay? So that's where I'm going to stop today. I think that gives you a good overall view. As you can imagine, there's much more that can be said about the background, but I think that gives you a really good overview. And what I'd like to do, Yahweh willing, next week is to really begin delving into chapter 1 and explaining other things as we go along, okay? So before we close with prayer, does anyone have any questions about anything that I've covered today? Is there anything that I can review or clarify? The number for guidance, are you referring to the term about steerage that I referred to earlier? Okay. So that is, let's see. The word takbula, I believe it is. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is number 8458. 8458. Steerage is if you're managing ropes. Is there anything else? Anything else that I can review or clarify? Going once. Going twice. Thank you, everyone. Let me stop the recording.